The might of correct words and correct behavior.
There is a creative natural law and a commandment that correct words and correct behavior are beneficial to all the human beings who use them and guarantee a life lived in decency, honor and dignity for everyone and give them friendships. Honesty and modesty are of paramount importance, as well as a non-seeking for influence and power in a negative sense, which is characteristic of so many human beings. Many have or want them, and are so stubborn in them that they do not want to turn away from them and cannot free themselves from them, because everything is too deeply rooted in them. From the bottom up, however, the natural laws and commandments of creation teach that the human beings should rule over themselves with all the power they need, but should not exercise this power in a negative way over their fellow human beings. Through every wrong form of education of those who have the power of education, and through wrong self-education, the human beings learn the hunger for domination of their fellow human beings and for power over them. And this is quite contrary to what the creative natural laws and commandments recommend, that absolute equality should prevail among all life forms. Although all herds of living beings as well as all groups, families, organizations and states, etc. need authoritative leadership. The laws and commandments of creation and nature dictate that this leadership should be equal to those who are led and should not be dominating and exercising power in a negative way. The same laws and commandments of creative natural origin teach that the human beings should not fight for power of domination over their fellow human beings, but should place themselves on an equal footing with all of them in equality. But the human beings of the earth pay no attention to this. For through false education, through misunderstanding and ignorance of the creative natural laws, he has become selfish, egoistic and power-hungry. As a result, the greater part of humanity fights for his power, defending it with every unfair means imaginable, contesting it from others and taking it away. And this happens from the most simple human beings up to the highest positions of governments, religions, sects and the economy, etc. And the fact is that there is a tremendous struggle for power and for the domination of fellow human beings who, as foot soldiers and subordinates, have nothing truly human to expect from those who are greedy for power and domination. If we take a closer look at the domination and exercise of power in relation to our fellow human beings, it can be seen that neither honesty and decency, nor humanity and honor, nor dignity can be applied when it comes to gaining power. Especially in this stage of attaining power, all negative, evil and unfair means are used ruthlessly. And if the goal of gaining power is actually achieved, there are always enough stupid followers who cheer the victors, even when they are bullied to the point of blood by them. The arena of power struggles takes many different forms, and even many people enter it in order to gradually gain dominance over their fellow human beings. But in fact there is also another way, namely to become truly human beings, to dominate oneself alone and only exercise power over oneself, while one's own person is placed on an equal footing with the fellow human beings in honor and dignity, in equality and equal rights. But very few people can do this because they do not know how this works and how correct behavior must be worked out. Only a few really are where the capacity for correct action and doing permeates. The majority, however, depends on the negative rules of power, and consequently, the laws of equality and equivalence cannot be applied. Nor can the modesty, honor, honesty, and dignity, which alone can really strengthen one's own inner and outer position. Once the mastery and power over one's own person has been won, even if it has to be worked out very laboriously, then it is recognized that it is not necessary to break the rule and power of others. Because only one's own strength, mastery and power over one's own personality, one's own character, and one's own positive balanced behavior are of real value. Those who have influence and power over themselves are also the only ones who decide how they respect their fellow human beings in honesty, honor, justice, love, and dignity. how they treat them, or how they lead them humanely without exercising negative power when they are elevated to a position of leadership. And the one who leads his fellow human beings with an open and honest smile, who treats and respects them decently and treats them respectfully in equality and equity, is truly the human beings who do not manipulate others. Manipulation of the human beings is only peculiar to those who have lost their power, who constantly live according to rules of dominance and consider themselves to be much more than they really are. But the human being is far from domination. He is concerned to be equal to his fellow human beings in every respect, and therefore he also behaves in every conceivable necessary relationship in such a way that he is considered by them to be equal and of equal value. This means that the human being's honest and correct behavior and words are always formed in such a way that trust and togetherness are the result. Using correct words and correct behavior also means that, outside of any ambition of power struggle, everything is perceived and understood correctly, so that no misunderstandings arise and no wrong decisions are made. It is also essential to ensure that the human beings to whom words are addressed and to whom behaviors are presented receive and understand everything correctly and also recognize the honesty and dignity of the whole. If this happens, then it is imperative for the righteous, except for troublemakers, know-it-alls, malicious critics, liars and slanderers, etc., that they respond to the honesty of words and behavior and react positively. It should be noted, however, that those who want to dominate their fellow human beings also use the same methods, but in absolutely unfair forms that are harmful to their fellow human beings, which enables them to dominate, enslave, and exploit their followers. A true human being, for whom honesty, honor and dignity and all virtues as well as freedom, peace and harmony are great values in life, takes care that he is always his own lord and master over himself, that he decides for himself in all things due to him, and that he is consciously responsible for everything and anything and for his own existence and life. This also means that he observes the rule to draw attention to himself, his rights, his knowledge, his abilities, his possibilities, and his attitude, and to stand up for this in his family, friends and acquaintances, and also in public, if this should be absolutely necessary. However, no role of justification should or must be played in this, nor must complete isolation and retreat, because, as required by necessity, there must always be a question and answer session, for which various forms are possible. However, malicious, lying, criticizing, know-it-all and slanderous attacks should not and need not be dealt with unless they are made absolutely necessary by specific situations. Such attacks are invariably attributed to stupid and inexperienced human beings and usually kill themselves. However, it is important for the human beings to be perceived with their honor, honesty and dignity, as well as with their knowledge, their actions and their behavior, so that they do not disappear into oblivion. But if he does not pay attention to being perceived, then he will become a loser, because only by drawing attention to himself and by acquiring attributes of recognition and respect will the human beings also be granted the value he deserves. For him, however, this does not only refer to his own family, his circle of friends and acquaintances, but also to all his fellow human beings with whom he comes into direct or indirect contact. In fact, it is true that everything that is not seen by his fellow human beings in one or more of them is simply ignored, counts for nothing, and has no value. If the human beings and their behavior and their statements, explanations, actions, deeds and words are perceived at all, then it does not matter at all whether the whole thing is positive or negative, good or bad. What falls into the observation and perception of human beings or causes headlines in the media, because what is important is that the observations and perceptions are made at all, and that headlines attract attention. The fact that friends and enemies emerge from this is just as inevitable as the fact that if friends are to be won, enemies will also inevitably appear. But it is fundamental that the human beings have to do something. On the one hand, to stand up to themselves, and on the other hand, to attract the attention of their fellow human beings and to be noticed at all. So, the human beings must not hide their own light under a bushel, because otherwise they will not be noticed and will be consistently and repeatedly disadvantaged and considered stupid and clueless. But he must also not let his own light shine brightly over him, otherwise he himself will only be seen, adored and lifted above himself in a circle of rays, which inevitably leads to arrogance, megalomania, selfishness, self-importance, overestimation of himself, and arrogance, etc. Therefore, your own light must always shine, but only in the correct light. And for this to be and remain so, or will be so, the right words and the right behaviour must always be chosen and cultivated, because the correct words and behaviour make the music that human beings like to hear and perceive. Truthfully, a single word or a single short sentence, as well as behaviour, determines how the human beings are perceived. The words and behaviour of each individual human being are judged by his fellow human beings, and consequently a judgment is made through them, through which the human being is neither humiliated, hated, despised, disregarded or respected, loved, honoured and honoured. When dealing with the human beings, nothing is as effective and important for the individual as his language, his words and his behaviour, because this is what is looked after as nothing else, and from this is judged and judged. The language, words and behaviour of the human beings direct their thoughts and feelings in very specific directions, so that many friends can be made, or many enemies made, depending on how everything affects different human beings. Language and just a few words and behaviour can make friends enemies and enemies friends. The correct language, the use of correct words, and the correct behaviour of the human beings will in any case lead to friends being gathered around them and to them, respecting, honouring, appreciating and loving them. It is not to be avoided, however, that hostile people also appear, know-it-alls, cheats, critics, and all sorts of other opponents who, out of envy and other base motives, are averse to recognising and accepting the great values that others have in relation to them. But it is important for the honest and good human beings not to care about these adversaries, and not to pay attention to their bad actions, but simply to let them run wild in their madness. For any justification towards them would only strengthen their feeble-minded actions, which finds its reason in their boundless stupidity. It is all the more important for the human beings to know how to use their language and their words, and how to behave, how and when they create great benefit for themselves, or how and when they harm themselves. Using certain words is of enormous importance, because the correct choice of words creates many friendships and attracts many like-minded people, and it is of the utmost importance that when speaking, one does not constantly speak of one's personality and of the I. If people are already talking about their own person, it must be in a simple language, not one that is related to me, and in such a way that everything is presented in a simple way of speaking and in simple, modest words, without making a fuss and presenting oneself as a hero. Telling something modestly, not cutting up, but simply telling something interesting in a simple way with equally simple words always creates attentive listeners and friends, while the human beings who, on the contrary, only emphasize, cut up and exaggerate themselves, only reap boredom, inattention, and enmity. If the human beings want to win friends, be respected, honoured and appreciated, then they must be educated in honesty and certainty in their attitudes, thoughts and feelings in such a way that they are a part of the whole of humanity, even when they lead their own lives as individuals. In this way he can speak of himself, if something is related to him alone, but if there are any fellow human beings involved in this life or in actions and deeds etc. connected with it, then it is in any case disrespectful, dishonest, undignified, mean and selfish as well as contemptuous, if any things are spoken of in an ego form when other human beings are involved. If only the I is spoken of when others are involved in something, such as property, possessions, work, an action or deed, etc., then this is not only unfair and selfish, but also a lie, a deception and a slander. So if there is any common ground, it is never the I, but only the we. Because what is done together is not the business of any one person, but of all of us together who are involved. This also applies when something is being sought together, when something has to be done and done together, when something has to be determined and carried out. And when the we is spoken of in this way, then all those involved in the whole feel addressed. And it may even be said that the honest and dignified we also addresses enemies, which can break some enmities. This is based on the fact that the human beings, when addressed by the we, consciously feel part of the human community. This creates a brain chemical reaction that produces the hormone dopamine, which pervades thoughts and feelings with impulses of happiness. If the language, the words and also the behaviour of a human being is directed towards the corresponding community of human beings through the honest and dignified use of the word value we, then positive thought and feeling impulses arise for him. And this is also the case when the human beings, through what they speak, perhaps reduce their prestige somewhat. The use of the word we is of paramount importance in general and in specific cases in dealing with the human beings, as is the request, which has a very special meaning as well as should or should instead of must. If something should or should be done, and the phrase this or that should still be done is used in this context, then this corresponds both to a request and to the fact of something that cannot be postponed, which is incurred and is to be done, but which is not must be done by order, but is should done voluntarily. If must is used in the language in the sense mentioned above, then the whole thing is in any case always tantamount to an order and compulsion, which is, however, omitted by the shall, which expresses the voluntariness of doing something. And if, in relation to something, the whole is connected with please, just when something is asked for or should serves as a direct request to do something, then the human being's free will is addressed, so that they themselves have to decide whether they want to do something or not. And if something is released in this way, then the other person becomes more compliant, and on his own initiative follows the indirect request to do what is should or should be done. With this specifically determined voluntary insertion into a job or into something is also connected a compatibility, peaceableness, an appropriate decency as well as commitment, harmony and a connecting, friendly and joyful behaviour, etc. If, on the contrary, there is a must, then this is always compulsively conditioned, and then automatically listlessness, joylessness, resistance and all other negative emotions appear, whereby the work to be done may suffer qualitatively from this and be carried out with poor performance, because the whole thing can only be laboriously mastered as a result of the must compulsion. This should be viewed and judged from a purely psychological point of view. If something has to be talked about, told or explained, there is a golden rule that must be observed. In this case too, the person speaking, telling or explaining is free to decide whether or not to follow the rule by should, respectively should. And this rule says and teaches that only as much as necessary should be said, no matter whether it is about sensitive or tough things and topics. If, for example, the subject matter to be dealt with is rich in learning, short explanations encourage the listeners to think about everything themselves and to try to understand the whole thing, which in turn leads to the fact that sooner or later correspondingly pertinent questions are asked, which require further explanation. Of course, this can take time, from a few minutes to several years, during which time everything is considered and understood. This is the inevitable development of oral learning, as it begins at an early age in children, when the educators have to explain all sorts of things to them, and they have to answer questions. Depending on the individual case, it is also the case that the person speaking and explaining also removes the basis for unnecessary speculation if certain sensitive things and topics are only addressed or explained as far as necessary. By talking only as much as necessary and avoiding unnecessary discussions, the person speaking and explaining or teaching also does not have to bear the responsibility if misunderstandings arise among the listeners due to misinterpretations. Therefore, the rule should always apply that when speaking, explaining, telling and teaching, everything should always be presented concisely, dryly and unadorned, but honestly, clearly, distinctly and accurately. On the one hand, many values can be expressed quickly and comprehensively, and on the other hand, this way of speaking encourages the interest of the listeners, which makes the person speaking become a rooster in the basket, so to speak, which should not lead to arrogance, selfishness, self-importance, and delusions of grandeur. There is also a rule that says that one should remain calm and simple on the ground of modesty and restraint. Dignified human beings say little, only in accordance with reality and its truth, and they speak only when necessary, which is why they also have a very impressive, trusting, and interpersonal value for their fellow human beings. At the same time, they are also very clearly aware that if they speak little, and only according to reality and its truth, they cannot say anything banal, stupid, or wrong. If something is said, spoken, explained, told or taught, then this always requires a certain point in time. Therefore, a precise timing respectively and exact, precise coordination of the processes. Timing has to be observed, for example, the exact and correct point in time when and how something should be said, done, or explained. If this is not observed, then this is a serious mistake that can bring about many disadvantages, many hardships, and many evils, whereby the word alone should be remembered that whoever is in the wrong place at the wrong time, or whoever says the wrong thing at the wrong time, suffers great harm. If the coordination of the processes and the correct timing is also not observed when talking, explaining, telling, teaching, and lecturing, then the whole thing will go wrong. This, however, must be avoided and requires that everything be considered in the correct way. But if this is ignored, then this is a serious mistake that can cause immense damage. Even the words and sentences that are used must be constantly checked. Otherwise, there is a danger of getting caught in the nettles or making oneself impossible. Even the best words and sentences that are put together have to be constantly checked for their correctness and revised if necessary. This is also necessary when time is ticking away, when there is a delay, or when things go faster than expected. If a wrong word or a wrong sentence is said at the wrong time, something is explained, told, instructed, or taught at the wrong time, this can lead to a personal or community disaster. This is also the case when the human beings want to make their voice heard or claim their rights in any matter. It is also true that quick and rational thought, deliberation, and quick action are required, because delays caused by slow thinking and deliberation can cause enormous damage. This is a point which power-hungry people hate deeply because, as a rule, they want everything to be done quickly in their favour, so they bring time into play as a decisive factor, which is usually lacking in their fellow human beings because they are more calm and leisurely in their thoughts and feelings. So they have a lot of time to make up their minds, but this time is running out for those who are obsessed with power. So time plays a decisive role for them, and they are constantly pressed to achieve their power goals. But this is inevitably connected with the fact that they use rhetorical manipulation to influence the views and opinions of the listeners or subordinates in a violent and coercive way, and to break the will which is inherent in them and only weakly present. Thus, the listeners or subordinates are not able to prevent the plans of those in power or to throw them off when they come into being. So it is true for the normal, simple human beings, who do not possess the lust for power themselves, that they always stick to reality and its truth, which also means that they make use of their own rationality, use their intellect and reason, and through them recognize the lust for power of the powerful and defend themselves against them instead of joining in the howling of power. This may be deeply painful for the human beings who are in bondage to the lust for power, who regard them as idols, who lie at their feet and crawl before them in the dust, but who humiliate themselves to a roaring humility. In dealing with the human beings, it is of special importance that they are addressed by their correct name, because to hear one's own name from the mouth of a fellow human being, or to read it in a letter, etc., is music to his ears and creates impulses of happiness in him. This really has nothing to do with arrogance, megalomania, selfishness, and the like, but with the fact that he wants to be appreciated as a human being's in decency, honesty, and respect, which is also his right. The titles of doctor or director or any other title are of no significance whatsoever to a healthy, normal and reasonable thinking person, for they are as fundamental as smoke and mirrors and say nothing about the character, personality and state of human beings. And as a rule, only the selfish, self-important and arrogant, etc., are keen on such titles in terms of what they refer to. In all this, the sound and correct emphasis of words and sentences also plays a very important role, as does their positive or negative form. In this respect, especially in the 1980s, a wickedly wrong form of stressing words and sentences appeared around the world, resulting in a disharmony of words, sentences, and language that has lasted until the present day of the 21st century. And just as this extremely negative and bad form of word and sentence stress has spread, so has everything negative and bad spread worldwide. Since this linguistic disharmony, the false emphasis of words and sentences, came into being, a great deal of what the human beings of the earth are doing is going up and down in the world. A great deal is going wrong and is moving in destructive ways. The completely disharmonious forms of organized wheeling and dealing, which since the 1980s has been called music and song, as well as the false emphasis on words and sentences, have had an increasingly negative effect on everything up to the present day. Sectarian religious terrorism has spread throughout the world. Massacres of the human beings through riots and more acts of war have increased enormously, as well as a worldwide mismanagement of banks, states, companies, corporations and families, etc. And all of these are undeniable effects of what has been a very bad negative trend of misuse of words and sentences from the 1980s, even if the self-proclaimed seven-eyed think it is ridiculous and refuse to believe it. The whole thing, however, causes an enormous amount of physical and psychological pain to the human beings, which cannot be fully processed by the pain center in the brain, and as a result they become more and more freaked out, lapse into mental crises, give free rein to enormous aggressions and become antisocial and unable to live, etc. If we take a closer look at the human being's language, the words and the sentences that emerge from them, we can see that they contain much more than just their pure content. The language, the words and the sentences with which the human beings communicate with each other and with each other are an emotional power from which nobody can escape. Thus, individual words alone determine whether someone is taken seriously or not. And if, for example, and, or, but, nevertheless, then, well, so, nah and, I, or nevertheless, etc. are used constantly or frequently when speaking, then the human beings who speak offer a large surface for attack, which reveals their goals and causes mistrust and antipathy. If one's own strength and integrity, as well as one's modesty, honesty, honor, and dignity, are shown to advantage in a conversation, in a speech, or in teachings and explanations, then these must also be expressed openly through language. This requires, However, that in relation to one's own values, knowledge, abilities and possibilities, a healthy dominance based on modesty must be shown and played along, which does not result in any manipulation of the listeners, but on the contrary, in a deliberately own interest, whereby they also recognize, acknowledge, and respect the values of the speaker. This is not about a power struggle between the person speaking and the listeners, nor is it about wanting to gain influence, but solely about the fact that everything is clearly and unambiguously appreciated with interest by the listeners, so that the whole thing can be understood and comprehended, which includes questioning the matter, as well as the necessary answers and explanations. Only human beings who are immodest and strive for power underpin everything they say and do with such perceptible dominance that the listeners are manipulated and believe that it is their own opinion if they take the same line as the power theorists. In every situation, power-obsessed people fight for their dominance in an absolutely immodest and negative way. Manipulation, violence and coercion, but also acting, lying and cheating, as well as slander, revenge and retribution are indispensable means for them. And when they strive to increase their influence and power, they do not even consciously perceive what evil and degenerate and inhumane things they are actually doing. When they strive for their supremacy and command, or defend their position of power by manipulation, violence and coercion, and all unfair means. The rule of the whole, however, is that very often the fight is not open, but only subliminally, to fool the fellow human beings through lies and deception, and not to let them see the true face and the true intentions hidden behind the power-hungry machinations. If, however, these lousy emotions and machinations of the power-hungry are recognized by their fellow human beings, then situations arise which undermine and make it impossible for those striving for power to achieve their goals. Thus the power behavior and the retention of power of the power-obsessed can only function as long as the fellow human beings do not control their own intellect, their own reason and their own power of decision, but leave everything to the power-hungry. As long as those possessed of power can control their emotions through their rational thinking and hide them from their fellow men so that they do not recognize the true nature of those who hold power, they can exercise their power and keep the people under their thumb. And this has also affected the whole earthly humanity since time immemorial, which has been proven true during thousands of years of earthly human history. The history of terrestrial humanity is a history of wars, massacres, uprisings, revolutions and murders, criminality, crimes, and the degenerated religious sectarian madness which has cost millions of human lives. And it is a history of revenge and retribution, of greed and avarice, as well as injustice, torture, the death penalty, depravity, and all evil degenerations. There have always been tremendously evil and wicked thoughts, feelings and emotions involved in all of this. But in principle, every human being should control them at their best and not offer them as weapons to the power-hungry and enemies. If the human beings want to appear valuable in life in the best possible way in relation to their fellow human beings, then they must make themselves indispensable in a good and positive sense. But this can only be achieved through words and a behaviour of honesty, respectability, and dignity. In this sense, he must confront his fellow human beings with the correspondingly correct words and with his behaviour, as well as with his actions, deeds, thoughts and feelings, compassion, and in living out all virtues. He must never stray from these values, but if he does, he will suffer endless defeats, inner misery, hardship, suffering and pain. Truly, it is the human being's duty to assert themselves in life in all conceivable situations, and if they are unable to do so, then it is their duty to seek help from correspondingly wise fellow human beings. Fundamentally, however, the human beings have to make their own decisions and put them into practice through their own willingness to make decisions, to develop their own creativity in all forms of their own abilities and possibilities, and also to bear full responsibility for this. It is the duty of every human being to cultivate and display an elementary expression of independence, love, inner peace and inner freedom and harmony, as well as compassion, humanity, honor, goodness, honesty and dignity in every situation in life. And only by doing so, and only if all decisions in this regard are made by the human beings themselves, will they determine their own course in life. In this way, however, he also relieves his fellow human beings in many respects, because he exemplifies responsibility for them and shows them how to accept it, but also relieves them of many things. Many people are afraid of being someone who is supposed to have some kind of responsibility towards their fellow human beings, the flora and fauna and the planet, etc. And this is even the case with some people who have to act as superiors or otherwise lead human beings in leading positions and who have to assign or control work. This fear is usually based on the fact that on the one hand, decisions are to be made and on the other hand, that mistakes could be made. The fact is, however, that when deciding on any matter, it is not necessarily important that everything is done right, because basically mistakes are always allowed, because without them nothing can prosper and nothing can become right. And furthermore, mistakes are there to learn from, to correct, and then to make everything better so that in the end, with right words and right behaviour, more good, correct, and error-free decisions are made than wrong ones. It is the same with every job, action or deed, etc. that has to be done, but it is more important whether the necessary information is received and understood correctly, and whether it is correct, ambitious, or misunderstood and carried out without interest, which leads to mistakes. The power of correct words and correct behaviour also refers in every respect to teaching and teaching in relation to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, which is intended to help and guide the human beings of the earth to think and feel about the creative natural laws and commandments, to perceive, understand, and obey them. In this respect, the words of the person giving the teaching must be chosen in a correct and appropriate manner, and his behaviour must also be in accordance with the teaching. And this teaching, the spiritual teaching, respectively the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, does not contain anything in itself in such a way that it is intended to change the world, as the unneeded may misunderstand and thus attack, for example, the spiritual teaching and those who teach it. But these attacks are made only because the wisdom of the attackers to understand reality and its truth through understanding and reason is not yet correct and not formed, because they lack the decisive experience of life, through which a clear-sightedness could be shrewdly achieved. And if such inexperienced human beings want to speak wisely, and believe that they would choose the correct words for this purpose, as these have been used by clever believers since time immemorial, A. G. If you want to change the world, you have to start with yourself, then this way of speaking has a bitter taste. The bitterness is related to the incomprehension of the person who uses such dubious, old-fashioned words, without understanding what is actually being said wrongly. Neither the spiritual teaching, nor any other good and positive teaching about the human beings turning to, perceiving, accepting and implementing in life the natural laws and commandments of creation is aimed at changing the world. Any such teaching is only meant to work on the human being and to form him or herself into a true human being, whereby the should always stands for the fact that the human being has to decide for himself or herself whether he or she wants to do something or not. Therefore, any such teaching is solely aimed at the individual human beings who voluntarily make an effort to learn. And when he does so, he is living the whole of the teaching for his fellow human beings as well. And this is because only in this way is it possible to do justice to what is taught orally, in writing, through actions, deeds, and behaviour, in correct words, in good, positive, and right things. In the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life as well as in every other good and positive teaching, the correct words are of importance, which should be aimed at addressing the human beings of the earth, so that they should strive to perceive the creative natural laws and commandments, to orientate themselves towards them, to accept them, and to change and behave according to them. And explicitly, the should is in the foreground, because the whole of the pros and cons in every way lies in the absolutely own decision of each human being. So there is nothing connected with manipulation, missionary work, violence and coercion, because everything lies in the free decision of each individual. And contrary to the religions and sects and various organizations, etc., the spiritual teaching and any other good and positive teaching given in the same framework is not a fascinating instrument of salvation and power, nor is it something that is supposedly advantageous with regard to material things, or with regard to divine help and the best, or at least good divine destiny. Every delusional belief in God in every imaginable form is bound to obligations and reciprocations in such a way that one has to pray respectively beg for something divine, for divine help and divine blessing, etc. And if the begging is supposedly answered, then this again corresponds to a service in return, namely on the part of the divinity, which in turn requires a service in return on the part of the believers and praying or begging people, respectively, so that they have to answer the divine gifts or God's help granted with much more thankful prayers. Ultimately, it is to be said that those who do not choose the correct words and do not form their behavior correctly will be disadvantaged by life and by their fellow human beings. When choosing the correct words and behavior, it is also important not to disregard your fellow human beings, not to rise above them, and not to treat them less than yourself. One's own true greatness must always be somewhat dampened outwardly by modesty, but if this is not done, arrogance, selfishness, and overestimation of self, etc., will result. It is therefore also necessary to cultivate true modesty in the use of correct words and behavior, which corresponds to great skill in dealing with one's fellow man. Modesty is also a dampening measure not to speak boastfully of oneself, and not to let oneself shine in one's own light. For the more the human beings, through immodesty, make themselves and their actions, deeds, words, and behavior shine, the more they irritate those who listen to them. And this happens because the own shining, by which the own personality is to be lifted up, usually by boasting, etc., makes the fellow human beings fall the deeper into the darkness and makes them appear inferior and void. So it happens that the more luminous the human beings are, the darker they see themselves, and their fellow human beings even consider themselves stupid and inferior, which often leads to psychic consciousness disorders. Therefore, if the human being, in true and honest modesty, is sage and wise in his relations with his fellow human beings, and knows the laws and commandments of equality, equivalence, and equal rights, he knows that his own superiority over other human beings is in any case trivial, stupid, false, and harmful. Therefore, it is absolutely not necessary, and therefore not required, for the human beings who are truly and honestly humble to show superiority over others, as through boasting, lies, spreading rumours, and slander. Right is only to express oneself only with true, good, positive and correct words, and equally with a similar behaviour, and with one's own opinions, knowledge and compassion, with true love and wisdom, and with valuable actions and deeds.
Billy Sim Yase, Silver Star Center, the 2nd of June 2012, 102 HRS.